So we are in chapter 4, Perek Dalet, the 18th Mishnah, Mishnah Yud Ches. This is the Mishnah about, the road that's paved with good intentions? That's this Mishnah. This is the Mishnah about the road that is paved with good intentions. And perhaps by way of introduction, before we start the Mishnah, I'd like to tell you a story that they tell about the great Rabbi Yisrael of Vizhnitz. Great Vizhnitzer Rebbe. And this is a story that illustrates how sometimes it's best rather not to say something that won't be accepted or heard, rather than, you know how it is, we often feel like we have to say something. So in this particular case, this Rabbi Yisrael of Vizhnitz went to this individual who was a very wealthy individual. He was the president of the local bank. And he came to his house. And of course, the man was very taken aback and very honored that Rabbi Yisrael should come to his house. He invited him in and he gave him a very comfortable place to sit and he offered him something to drink. And then he waited to see why Rabbi Yisrael had come. You know, what he wanted to tell him. Nothing. Didn't say a word. So it was like this awkward silence. You know that awkward silence where you don't quite know what to say? You know that awkward silence? Nobody knew what's supposed to happen. Anyhow, after about half an hour of sitting in awkward silence, Rabbi Yisrael gets up and he heads for the door. So the host says to him, I'm sorry, but why did you come? If you don't mind, with respect, why did you come visit me? You didn't say anything, you didn't tell me anything, why did you come? So Rabbi Yisrael said, I came to fulfill the teaching of our chachamim, of our sages, that it is better not to say something that a person will not accept than to say something. So now the fellow was really curious. He said, well, what were you going to say that you thought that I wasn't going to accept? So he says, I'll tell you. There's a woman in the community who's a widow, who's had a terrible time financially, and she owes your bank a large sum of money. So what I really wanted was for you to arrange to excuse her debt. To wipe the slate clean, because she can't afford to repay it. So the fellow says, Rebbe, I'm just the president of the bank. There's shareholders, there's an executive. I don't make those decisions on my own. I don't have the authority to make that decision. It has to go to the board for review. So Rabbi Yisrael says, you see, that's why I didn't want to say anything. Because you're not supposed to say anything if it's not going to have the desired impact. So that's why I don't want to say anything. So the fellow was smart enough to realize that if the Rebbe came to him, it wasn't just to play this game and illustrate that, he wasn't able to say anything. And he said, all right, I understand the point. I'll personally cover her debt. And that was the end of the story. But what the story illustrates is the importance. We speak a lot about speaking. And we speak about it not talking badly about people. It's a very big feature in our lives, not to speak Lashon Hara. This Mishnah we're going to learn today is that there are many other ways of speaking that are also not healthy, that are also not good, either for ourselves or for the other person or for our relationship with Hashem. And so this is the Mishnah that is going to provide us with various scenarios where we have to be so careful about what comes out of our mouths, because often with the best intentions, and that's the emphasis of this Mishnah, with the best intentions, that's often where we create the worst outcomes, as ironic as that sounds. So before we start the Mishnah, let's first meet the Tana of the Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon Benelazo. And that is interesting because we've just come from Lag BaOmer, so don't get confused with the reverse, Rabbi Allaz by Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Allaz, the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. This is somebody else, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Now we don't know a tremendous amount about Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, but we do know this. We know he was a student of Rabbi Meir, and we know that he was an individual who lived a very long life. He was a colleague of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was the person who compiled the Mishnah, And Rabbi Shimon ben Allaz lived that long that already into the next generation, which was the time of the Gemara, there were people who knew him personally. So he clearly outlived many of his colleagues. Now there's a particular story that happened with Rabbi Shimon ben Allaz, and that story will speak to the first item on the agenda of what the Mishnah speaks about. So we'll come back to that story in a moment. But let's first have a look. What does Rabbi Shimon ben Allaz teach us? And again, we've seen this quite a number of times through our journey through Pirkei Avos, that very often the teaching that is central to a particular rabbi has to do with that particular rabbi's experience. And this is going to be one of those examples. So Rabbi Shimon ben Allaz says, Omer, he said 4 things. Number 1, Al teratzeh es chavercha b'shas ka'asoi. Don't try to placate your friend when the friend is angry. Okay? Sound advice? Yeah. Right? Don't try to placate a person while they're angry. That's number 1. Number 2, ve'al tenachamehu b'shah shemeisoi muto lefonav. Don't try to comfort a person when their dead is still lying before them, which basically means when it's a fresh wound. So it could be very practical that you don't comfort a person before the funeral, and that is practical in halakha. We don't offer words of comfort before a funeral, and it comes from this Mishnah, because that's a time of turmoil, not only emotional turmoil, but also practical turmoil, the things to organize. There's, unfortunately, when it occurs that a person has to deal with the loss, very often people don't know what they're supposed to be doing, and so it's not the time to try and give them words of comfort. They've got to get through the practicalities first. So it sounds like he's giving us very practical advice over here, right? Because we all know this. When a person is really angry, what's the worst thing to say to them? Calm down. Okay? So it's very practical advice, right? And this is also practical advice. Don't try and comfort a person before they've even begun the grieving process. Because prior to the funeral, they haven't really begun the grieving process. They're typically in shock or just caught up with arrangements. Then he says, Val tishalo b'shas nidroi. Don't ask a person at the time of them taking a vow. Now, it doesn't specify here, don't ask them what. So we'll have to explore what that means. What don't you ask them? Was this a nudnik? You know what a nudnik is? Everybody know what a nudnik is? Yes. The famous definition of the difference between a shlumiel, a shlumazel, and a nudnik. You familiar with this? A shlumiel is the kind of person who will spill their soup on somebody else's pants. A shlumazel is the person who will have the soup spilt on their pants. And a nudnik wants to know what flavor soup was it. So here's somebody who's taking a vow. Sounds like a nudnik, right? Start asking them questions. What did you mean? When does it apply? What caused you to take this vow? It sounds like a nudnik on the face of it. And then the last one is interesting because it's a little different. You'll notice a slight nuance over here. The last one he says is, Ve'al tishtadel lir'oisoi b'shas kalkolosoi. You shouldn't make the effort to see somebody at the time that they are disgraced. That sounds worse than a nudnik, right? That sounds like a person who dafka is almost baying for blood. They want to see. No, let's go see somebody when they're at their lowest, when they're exposed. Sounds like a terrible kind of person. Now remember that Pirkei Avos, as the Gemara in Bava Kama tells us, is mili de chasidusa. This is the part of Judaism that is supposed to teach us what is beyond the requirement of halacha, what is beyond the black and white of Judaism. This is how to become a real mensch, somebody who lives beyond what the Torah expects of us. So what are we talking to? Nudniks over here? To people who have no common sense, people who have no social etiquette, people who wish to see the worst for others. Doesn't make sense. So we're going to have to unpack each of these 4 and try and understand what it is that Rabbi Shimon ben Allaz is teaching us. But before we do that, let's first note a very important psychological insight that he's taught us. So let's go through the 4 scenarios and just test what it is about those 4 scenarios. When you see somebody in one of these 4 situations, what is the natural feeling that you would have? So when a person's angry, what's the natural feeling that you have when a person's angry?
You'd like to calm them down.
Why? That's what you'd like to respond. You'd like to calm them down. I'm asking a different question. What is your feeling at the time that somebody is angry?
You can't tolerate.
So it's right? It's difficult to tolerate, right?
Yes.
It's what?
Discomfort.
That's the word. You're uncomfortable. That's what happens. When we see somebody else is angry, we feel uncomfortable for a variety of reasons. We might feel unsafe. We might feel embarrassed on their behalf because there's other people around. And we know that afterwards they're going to calm down and they're going to look back and they're going to feel ashamed of how they behaved. So we may feel embarrassed on their behalf. I recently had a story, actually wrote it up in a little article, because I thought it was such an amazing moment of introspection. You know, sometimes Hashem sends you somebody else to give you introspection. So I was driving, I was actually stopped at a red light, and there was a car that was turning from the other side into our oncoming lane. And it was an older woman driving the car at her leisure. You know, she was going at whatever it was, I don't know, maybe 40 kilometers an hour. And immediately behind her was a younger guy who clearly had to be somewhere which he felt was very important. And you could see his face. He was like, I couldn't hear what he was saying, but you could see the expressions and the waving of the arms and the whole business. And the so-called target of his anger was completely oblivious to what was going on. Completely oblivious. And I felt almost if there would have been a camera at that point, and we could have videoed this fellow and then sent it to him, he would have been very embarrassed. But not just embarrassed, maybe the next time he'd think twice about the whole explosion that was going on inside his car that had no relevance to the person he was exploding at. So that's one of the reasons we want to calm a person when we see that they're angry, is because we're embarrassed on their behalf. We can see that other people are looking at that. This is crazy. What do you want about? Just relax. It's okay. It's not the end of the world. In other words, anger is a very intense human experience. And when a person is confronted with a very intense human experience, the nature of people is we want to de-escalate. We want to somehow remove the intensity of the situation. So it's quite natural for us that if we see that somebody's angry, we're going to want to respond. And that's going to become the theme in this Mishnah, is these are intense situations. And whenever there's an intense situation, human nature is to want to make it right. Without getting into the details of the story, there was a particular occasion where I once took somebody as part of a group, and we went to 770 Eastern Parkway, which is Chabad World Headquarters, which is not like going to Great Park Shul, you know, where everybody sits neatly in their space and you've got your pew and everything. It's a bit chaotic, you know, everybody's kind of on top of each other. And this particular individual didn't really handle it very well. And he was very angry, like, how could a shul be like this? You know, that everybody was just like, you know, that you often see this in these big Hasidic shuls, you know, everybody's on top of each other. Couldn't handle it. He was really angry. And the other people of the group kept telling me, go say something, you know, go explain it, like, placate him. And I just remember thinking of this mission and saying, I'm not saying a word, you know. And it was the best approach in the long run, because afterwards, you know, he was able to kind of come to terms with it on his own, which is obviously better than trying to put somebody in their place. But it is natural for us. If you're a non-confrontational person and somebody else is angry, naturally what you want to do is de-escalate. De-escalate or run away. Depends how much responsibility you feel for them. So that's the first example. Okay, now the second situation is as intense. Grief. Grief is a very intense human experience. And when we're confronted with grief, we naturally want to be able to still that grief. If there's anything that we could do to take away that pain, we would do it. So it's good intentions. It's just that in the context, because we're confronted with something which is so intense and we don't know how to handle it, that's why we'll often rush into a response, and it's not necessarily a helpful response. So that's the second scenario that he talks about, is when the person's dead is fresh and they haven't yet come to terms with it, they haven't begun to grieve yet. Or even if they have begun to grieve, as we'll see. Now the third one is tricky. Person who's taking a vow, what's intense about that experience? Person's taking a vow. The person promises that they're going to do something, right? I promise I'm going to come every Monday morning to the shir. Okay? So what's so intense about that?
Because it's something you're making between man and yourself and God.
True. So what's intense about it?
You need to make sure that they bleed.
But I'm saying, what's intense about the experience?
Passionate about what they
Passionate.
going to
Okay,
do.
good. So passionate is a good word, and is that the factor that comes to play in a vow? Is that the intensity of the situation? Who said it's not always rational, right? It's not always rational. It's not always rational. Okay? So therefore, because they're saying something that is irrational, what's my response? A response of fear. What if you've just undertaken something that you're not going to be able to fulfill? Because we are, typically, if you watch the person taking the oath, we're not necessarily as passionate as they are. We can afford to be objective. We can afford to step out of the scenario and say, let's do a due diligence over here, see whether it's feasible in the long term, etc. So, fear plays into the world of vows. Either I'm afraid that they won't be able to keep their vow, or they are afraid that they don't have any self-control, and therefore they have to take the vow. Because, as we know, nedorim siyag leprishus, that the concept of taking vows is a technique that we use in order to control ourselves when we can't control ourselves. So either way, it's somehow associated with the element of fear. Fear is a very intense human experience. So what do? We're afraid maybe the person's overstepped, maybe they've overreached. So what do? We start to ask them questions. Did you really mean this? Do you know what it entails? Are you sure? Just to use a very extreme example, what would happen? It's akin to a vow. It's not exactly a vow, but it's akin to a vow. Couple decides that they want to get married. So it's all very nice, right? Everybody comes over, mazel tov, it's fantastic. And then you get some nudnik who asks the question, are you sure this is the right person? Right? So there's an element of fear that creeps in. And it's not healthy for the vow, and it's not healthy for the commitment, and it's not healthy for where this person wants to go. So again, it's an intense experience where with good intention, because we're afraid. What happens if they now have committed themselves to the wrong person? So we're afraid, and we step in, and with good intention, it could cause negative results. And what's the last emotion that he speaks about? Kal koloso, the person who is disgraced. So what's the emotion that's associated with that? Is shame. Shame is a very intense human experience. And so again, when you see that a person is in a situation where they feel ashamed, it's natural for us to rush in and to try help them. Lehishtadel, that's why there's this subtle shift over here. Lehishtadel lir'oisoi. We want to make the effort to see them in a good light at the time that they're feeling disgraced. Not, God forbid, to suggest that somebody's going to say, oh, let's see, front row seats. Where's the great scandal in the community? I want to be there. But rather, lir'oisoi, to see them, to see their value at the time that they're feeling ashamed and disgraced. So all four of these sound like they're very well intended. You want to calm the person. You want to help them through grief. You want to ensure that they haven't undertaken something that's not practical. You want to somehow mitigate their sense of shame. All of these are good intentions, but they all are misplaced, and we've got to understand how and why. When I was in yeshiva in Israel, there was a personality, and I have mentioned him here before, who had a profound influence on my life. His name was Reb Mendel Futterfass. Reb Mendel Futterfass was an activist in Soviet Russia, helped to establish a network of underground schools and yeshivas, and also to smuggle people out after the Holocaust. Anybody who had a Polish passport could get out of Russia. So he was part of the network that forged Polish passports to get from people out of Russia. And then he was caught and he ended up in prison for whatever, a decade or so he was in prison. So Reb Mendel Futterfass once told us when we were in yeshiva, said the most important thing you have to know about human interaction is to say the right thing at the right time. He actually said, I recently heard somebody else say in his name that he had received a brocha from the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe that he would always have the ability to say the right thing at the right time. So then he explained to us, what does it mean to say the right thing at the right time? So he gives a simple example. It might sound humorous, but it's actually quite insightful. When you say good morning to somebody.
Yeah.
Is that an appropriate thing? It's a good thing to say, right? It's nothing wrong. It's an appropriate thing to say. Good morning is a good thing to say. If you say good morning to somebody at night, it's at the wrong time. Just because it's the right content doesn't mean this is the time for that content. Right? Simple. And what does it mean in the wrong place? You'll excuse the example. You go over to somebody in the bathroom, you say, good morning. It's the wrong place. It's good content, it's the wrong place. This is what Shlomo HaMelech says, davar be'itoi matoiv. Something that is said, davar is a play on words, right? Davar could mean a thing. A davar could also be from the word dibur, to speak. So davar, the word that a person says, be'itoi, in its appropriate time, matoiv, that's ideal. That's great. But the right words at the wrong time can be a horrible thing. That's Rabbi Shimon Benelazzo's lesson to us. And he starts off speaking about anger because of a story that happened to him personally. The Gemara records that Rabbi Shimon Benelazzo once encountered an individual who he saw was ugly. Now you know what they say about, beauty's in the eye of the beholder and all that. If Rabbi Shimon Benelazzo said that this person was ugly, they were ugly. It wasn't a personal thing. He said to this person, why are you so ugly? Okay? So he said to him, so why are you so ugly? So the man said to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, why are you complaining to me? Go complain to the craftsman who made me. And Rabbi Shimon felt very bad about the interaction, and he apologized. And the person refused to forgive him. Not only that, this person then went to the yeshiva where Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar taught, and he started telling him, this is your Rosh Yeshiva. This is who you listen to. This is who you respect. This person who doesn't even give dignity to an average individual like me. And he started a whole campaign discrediting Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar until eventually, down the line, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar was successful in getting this man to forgive him and to get off his case. Now, parenthetically, it's not the subject of our Mishnah, but parenthetically, it's quite important to know that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar honestly didn't care what a person looked like. He wasn't that kind of guy. I'm sorry to say this, but he wasn't into those things. When he said that the person was ugly, he was referring to spiritually. And he was trying to shake this person out of his reverie, thinking that he was an amazing human being, and telling him, listen here, you have to realize that you're ugly. The way you treat people, the way you behave. And by the way, look what he did. You can tell he had obviously a nasty side to him. And the guy said to him, and this was a valid response, but I didn't choose to have this personality. Yes, you can change. Not that you can change it. You have to change it. But his answer was, don't be critical of me for how I was made. That was his response. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar accepted that, and he realized that he should have rather coached him rather than criticized him. But what he learned in that moment, and from there on, and this became one of his grand teachings, is don't try and ask forgiveness of somebody when they're still angry with you. First, you've got to reach a point where you help them not to be angry with you anymore. And then you can placate them. In other words, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is not telling us over here the obvious, that if somebody is having a tantrum, you don't tell them calm down. Everybody knows that. In fact, some of the commentaries on this Mishnah even say that falls into a mitzvah in the Torah called Lifnei Iver Lo Siten Michshol, that you're never allowed to create a stumbling block for a person who is blind, which means that they have a blind spot to a particular area of behavior or of Jewish law. So if a person is angry, what happens? We all know what happens. What happens when you say to a person who's angry, calm down? That's called the red flag to the bull, right? That's called fuel to the fire. Because the natural response of who are you telling to calm down? Right? We're only going to make them more angry. That's not Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's teaching. That's psychology 101. That's Lifnei Iver, maybe. It's maybe a mitzvah, an actual mitzvah in the Torah, black and white Judaism. What Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is telling us is that when we have caused somebody to be angry, by the way we've treated them, by the way that we've spoken to them. If we're the cause of their anger, we will feel, wow, we better get this sorted out as soon as possible. Remember the last two Mishnahs that we learned. What did we learn in the last two Mishnahs? This world is just a transit space. You don't know how long you're going to be here. It's all preparation for the next world. So you might now feel pressure. Oh my gosh, I've got to do something. I got this person angry. I need to somehow sort it out. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon Benelazo says we have to realize that in spite of the fact that we are told in halacha that if we approach a person and ask them to forgive us and they reject us, and then we approach them a second time and they reject us, and we approach them a third time and they reject us, from there on it's their problem, right? That's the halacha. It's their problem if we have approached them 3 times. Says Rabbi Shimon Benelazo, yes, but in order to approach them the first time, we have to first ensure that they're no longer angry. To approach somebody, to ask their forgiveness while they're still angry is 0 times approach. We haven't started the process yet. First, we have to find a way to placate them, and then we can ask their forgiveness, which is quite a fascinating insight and gives us a lot of homework, right? So that's an interesting perspective. Of course it's difficult to do. That's why it's in Pirkei Avos. These are the things that are stretch goals.
What's the practical lesson on it?
The practical lesson is that if something has occurred where we've done something to hurt somebody else and they're angry at us because of it, before we can come with our agenda, which is we need forgiveness, we need to first approach with something that actually shows them that we are sorry for what we've done, that we care about them, and only after that can we have this conversation. Right? Because at the end of the day, the last thing a person wants to hear after we've offended them is how much we're worried about the fact that we might be in the wrong for having offended them. You know, we need them to feel that we actually care about them and that we want to somehow make up. Now, there's another perspective to this as well, a very interesting perspective. We are a dual soul system. That's our experience. We're a dual soul system. So you remember the story of Rivka when she didn't know she was expecting twins and she was very concerned because she felt that she had a mixed up child. Whenever she'd walk past a pagan temple, all kinds of movement. Whenever she walked past a place of Torah, the yeshiva of Shimon, all kinds of movement. So she was really concerned, what's going on inside? What kind of a crazy split personality am I going to be bringing into this world? And what did she do? She went to the prophet at the time, which was the ancient version of an ultrasound. And guess what she found out? That she had twins. And the message wasn't just that there's 2 of them, but specifically, that they'll constantly struggle for control. And they'll pull in different directions. And then she was happy. Now I want to know, which Jewish mother is going to be happy with that news?
None.
Before I thought I had one Meshugana inside me. Now, Baruch Hashem, I just have one evil person inside me. This is nachas. What? So you know what the Gemara says? Ein simcha kahatoras asveikos. There's no greater joy or liberating feeling than to be able to move from doubt, from uncertainty, to be able to create clarity. Now she had clarity. Now I know how to deal with this child, and I'll know how to deal with that child. That story, in addition to being the story of Rivka and her twins, is also insightful into the story of each of us in our lives. Because, what do you think? It was only Rivka who walked past a pagan temple and there was some kind of churning inside of her? It happens to all of us. Different places. One person walks past the stairs, gets a little bit something starts churning inside out, I wish that at Burger and Brew, they would make burgers like those burgers smell. Right? Happens to a person, some kind of a churning inside, right? And then, of course, we go to Ashir, Gan Eden. It's the most amazing place in the whole world. We want to learn Torah the whole day until the Shir is over, right? So we also have this conflict inside of ourselves. And we have the same message that Rivka was given. It's not one crazy mixed up person. We're a dual soul system. We have 2 different souls. One soul is called the Nefesh HaChiyunis. Its job is to keep us alive. That's its job. Its job is to care for us. It is the soul that Darwin writes about in The Survival of the Fittest. The evolution of species, the fact that we've got to be at the top of the pyramid. That's us. Nefesh HaChiyunis. That part of ourselves is not naturally trained to aspire to higher things. It just wants to put food on the table and achieve well in life and be happy. And then we have a deeper soul that we call the Nefesh Elokis, the godly spark that's inside of us. That is our true essence. Now that neshama, that's what we technically call the neshama, right? The neshama. The other one we could call the nefesh. So the neshama is naturally so powerful, so aligned, so connected. Problem is, we're not always in touch with it. And because we're not always in touch with it, if we had to be very honest, on a day-to-day basis, what do we experience more of? The nefesh or the neshama? The instinctive side or the aspirational side? The nefesh. That's our reality. Nobody wakes up in the morning. Sorry, not nobody. Some people. Most people do not wake up in the morning thinking, oh, I'm starving for Shacharis. We'd like to, but it's more likely we wake up in the morning thinking, breakfast. So because of that, our impulsive reactions will always go into Nefesh Achiyunis territory first, and then we have two choices. Either we shut it down and let the neshama take over, or if it's an intense experience and we can't shut it down, then we want to try plug the neshama in and use it. So here's a good example. Let's say that a person was feeling down. I'm not talking about clinical depression. A person's feeling down, happens to us, right? We all have our days. Some days we're up, some days we're down. Joburg, gloomy, cold weather, we're down. This doesn't belong over here, you know. Where we come from, if it's not blue sky, something's wrong. So, bit of gloomy weather, we're feeling down. Now, what happens when a person feels down? We're not as motivated to do the mitzvahs that we should do. We don't necessarily daven with so much intention, etc., etc. And one of the great perks of feeling down is we tend to discover the things that are negative about our lives and about ourselves. So when a person is feeling down, that's when a person will say things like, look how behind I am in my learning, in my spirituality. You know, that's when we find all the negative. So in the book of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe teaches, when a person's feeling down, perfect time to do what we call cheshbon hanefesh. You're feeling so self-critical anyway, so use it well. Use that as the opportunity to do a personal audit of where you're up to in spirituality, because you're in that space anyway. And then that in itself will actually help motivate a person to feel more positive, because now it's been a constructive experience rather than just a black hole. Same kind of concept here. Don't try placate the person who's angry. They went there because of the power of their nefesh, their nefesh achiyunis, their animalistic, impulsive side, took them into a very intense experience, and none of us has enough power to just pull them out of it. We all know how this is going to end. They will get over it. And they will have to do some damage control afterwards. And they will have to make apologies. But right now they're in an angry space. Don't try schlep out of it. In fact, we don't even have to try schlep ourselves out of it that quickly, but we can direct that anger. And I'll tell you a beautiful story, that there was an individual who once came to a shul, and it was on Shabbos Parshas Zochor. That's the Shabbos for Purim, right? You read about Amalek. Now, I don't know if you do it here. I've seen overseas in some communities they do it. At the end of Parshas Zochor, everybody bangs on the table or stamps their feet, similar to as we do for Haman during the Megillah. So in this particular shul, the fellow walks into the shul, and there's this very sagely looking individual standing next to the bima during the Torah reading. And when it reaches this point, the end of Parashat Zochor, everybody starts banging on the table, and he could just see in this person's eyes such anger. He couldn't believe it. How does such a refined person, who looks like he's such a scholar, have so much anger? He said, I don't understand. I've never seen anybody react like this. So he went over to him and he said, well, I'm worried. What are you going to do? Go attack somebody on the street and say he's Amalek? So the person explained to him that every nation that is mentioned in the Torah has a spiritual equivalent in our own lives. The nation of Amalek, as hinted at in the Torah, is the element of personal apathy. What does it say about Amalek? Asher korcha baderech, which means they ambushed us on the way. And korcha, obviously, from the word kar. cooled us off, which is apathy. He says, whenever I read about Amalek, who is called Reishis Goyim, meaning to say not just the first of all the nations, but more importantly, the first of all spiritual aberrations, when I think about Amalek, I think about my own personal apathy, and I become so angered at the possibility that I could be apathetic in my Judaism. I realize I've got to do everything in my power to get rid of it. That's not bad anger to have. So if you can't control the anger, direct the anger. Instead of being angry at the person, angry at the situation, become angry at something in our spirituality that's not as it should be, and put all of that energy into overcoming that particular spiritual obstacle. Okay? Not so simple to get right. That's more difficult, I think, than the other one. Very difficult. Okay. I'm going to have to move along because just in the interest of time. Now, what is the next example that he gives? And almost all of the commentaries on this Mishnah say the same thing about the next one, which is, don't try to comfort a person when their loss is fresh. Meisoi muto lefanov, which could mean practically that the dead person is still unburied, or muto lefanov, it's still top of their mind, it's still in the early stages of the grieving process where it's a very sharp pain. So what's he telling us? Ask people who've been through a severe loss, chas v'shalom, God forbid. People will often tell you that there are certain lines that were the most hurtful lines that they heard during that period. And it may be different from person to person, but certain lines are very painful. One of those very painful lines is, time will heal. And probably next, like the equivalent is, you have to be strong. Those expressions are very painful to somebody who's just had a loss for two reasons. First of all, so what are you saying? I'm not strong? Is that the implication? Like, if I feel real emotions, does it mean I'm not strong? Is there something against feeling a real emotion? And who can guarantee that time heals? Because very often what happens to a person after a loss is that time actually deepens the pain rather than heals the pain.
Exactly.
So what's wrong with these statements is that the person who makes the statement means well, always. Nobody says something to a grieving individual maliciously. It's always with good intention. That's the theme of this Mishnah, good intentions. It's always with good intentions. The thing is, though, that when a person says something with good intentions at the wrong time, remember that's what dava be'itoi, the wrong time, then it sounds like the person dismisses the reality of the pain. So almost all of the Meforshim on this Mishnah tell us that that's Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's message over here. What's his message? Don't say something that would minimize the person's pain. If we're quick to give comfort, that means we haven't yet allowed them to feel the loss or to feel the pain of that loss. And the only real comfort that somebody could ever give is to try to hear where they're at and to commiserate and to acknowledge the pain. That's comfort. But when you try to give comfort to the person while they're going through the pain, it comes out as sounding very insensitive, and it does the opposite. It makes the person feel unsupported, which only then exacerbates the pain.
Is that why we have a set thing to say?
It's interesting that you asked that, right? So we have a set thing to say, which is correct. By the way, the idea of saying "wish you long life," which is very South African, is not an halachic thing during Shiva. There's a concept that once Shiva ends that you say Arichos Yamim, that you wish long life. But we have a very specific formula that we say, which is Hamakom Yenachem Eschem B'Soch Velitzim Mishalayim, which is to immediately make it a collective experience. Hashem should comfort you amongst the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. In other words, we want to imply that it should be a shared experience rather than, I'm coming along to share comfort. But even more importantly is the halacha that says that when a person enters a Shiva house, it is the mourners who have to speak first. And many people can't handle awkward silence. So they try and compensate. It's human nature. Why? Because it's an intense human experience. So we want to step in and somehow release the tension. The reality is the single most comforting thing that we can do for a person, chas v'shalom, who's grieving, is to be in their space. If they want to talk, great. And if they don't want to talk, then we have to be in their space and be comfortable. Maybe it's not comfortable, but willing to be in their space. That's what Rabbi Shimon Benelazo is teaching us over here. Al tenachamehu. Don't be the one trying to band-aid the process. We've got to take the cue from the individual and be in their space rather than try and impose our space because it's more comfortable for us. Okay, just quickly finish off the Mishnah because we're almost out of time. So the third thing he teaches is that you don't ask a person questions at the time that they've made a vow. Vows are very complicated in halacha. They're not as straightforward as everybody thinks. That's why we consistently use phrases like bli neder. I don't want to get into a vow because it's very complicated. What's complicated about a vow is this. When a person makes a vow, if we can prove afterwards, when we find that they're struggling to keep the vow, if we could prove afterwards that they weren't aware of the full extent of the vow, we can use that as leverage to annul the vow in front of a court. Now, what happens when a person starts asking questions? Are you sure you can do this? Yes, I can. Did you consider that? Yes, I did. What about this potential issue? Oh, good point. So what do? We create less opportunities to be able to give them that leverage, to be able to get out of the vow if it wasn't appropriate. So we think we're helping them by asking all the questions up front to try and ensure that they're in the safest place possible. Actually, the safest place possible is to let the person make their vow. And then if afterwards it doesn't work out, then we have all these halachic loopholes that we could probably bring to the fore. Oh, you didn't realize this, you didn't consider that. Let's annul the vow on that basis. But in trying to ask all of those questions, we actually lock them into the vow and achieve the exact opposite of what we wished to achieve. As when we try to placate a person, we achieve the opposite of calming them down. When we try to comfort a person, we achieve the opposite of giving them comfort. And then the very last point he tells us is, Al tishtadel liroisai. Tishtadel, don't try to see somebody when they're in a place or in a time, in a situation in their life where they are disgraced or ashamed. Now the word tishtadel implies what? That we shouldn't put in effort, we shouldn't try, we shouldn't make a point of being there when they're going through that difficulty. So what's the implication? Sometimes these things happen and we didn't try to do it. Sometimes we just happen to be there when somebody is disgraced. So now what? Now what? He says specifically, Al tishtadel, don't make a point of putting ourselves into the space where somebody is disgraced. But what if it comes our way? What if we happen to be in the place at the time, or we happen to get information, or whatever the case is? So then the message is, if Hashem chose for me to be the one who's aware of the fact that they're going through this difficulty, that is a sign that I'm supposed to help them through this period. And this is a big issue because sometimes what happens is that a person gets caught up, and it does happen. People get caught up in behaviors and they make choices that they shouldn't have made. And as a result of that, they very often are sidelined by the community because there's a scandal. And there'll always have to be those individuals who can still hold them so that they don't disappear completely from our midst. It's like the story of the boy who behaved so badly in the yeshiva that he was expelled from the yeshiva. This is back in the shtetl, where to live in the yeshiva meant that you were weeks travel away from home. And the yeshiva was everything. It was accommodation, it was food. And the boy was expelled from yeshiva. Expelled from yeshiva meant he literally had nowhere to sleep that night. He had nowhere to get food. And he walks out with his little knapsack or whatever he had onto the street, deciding where to go next. And the mashgiach of the yeshiva, who had just expelled him, comes over to him and says, okay, now you're going to stay at my house. Don't look to find the experience of where somebody is disgraced. But if you have to be part of that experience, it's a sign that you've got to also somehow help them through that period of their disgrace so that they can come out on the other side rehabilitated and healthy and please God, successful going forward. So that's a very important lesson for us, right? Because sometimes things come our way that we don't necessarily choose, and we may ourselves have a difficult time with the community because we're now suddenly helping somebody who has been disgraced, but maybe that's just our personal shlichus at that particular point in time. It's quite a thought, right?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Rabbi.